The fatigued silhouettes staggered across the railroad bridge, which was difficult with its ties loosened by shelling. This was the last lifeline south, towards Seoul. The bridge wasn't supposed to be there anymore. It was supposed to have been blown, to slow the enemy's advance. These soldiers were lucky the explosives malfunctioned. They were nearly across when a pair of tanks appeared behind them. There was nothing they could have done. There was nothing any of them could have done. The Iron Curtain was dropping on the 38th parallel. The Korean War had begun. Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 14, Eyes of Dawn. It's been a while since we've discussed the title of an episode. Were it not a personal rule of mine to not take episode titles directly from book chapters related to the topic, this week would be called A Quiet Weekend in June. That's chapter 17 of Bruce Cummings' second volume of The Origins of the Korean War. Indeed, the topic of today's episode was, more or less, a quiet weekend in June. Instead, today's episode is named after the sweeping epic Korean television drama Eyes of Dawn. I highly recommend it to anyone interested in the human side of the war, as it covers Korean history through what we've covered so far up to the end of the war. With today's episode covering the initial invasion and the fall of Seoul, I think that Eyes of Dawn is an apt description of this turning point in both Korean history and in wider international history. The Korean War would forever alter Korea. It would shape American society in some deeply important ways, it would define Communist China's role in the world, and it would show world leaders that international conflict could break out without spiraling into another world war. When the world woke on that drizzly morning in June, its eyes opened to a new dawn, one that would be many things to many people, but for all, one that was wholly different from the world before. There are two stories of how the Korean War began. The conventional one, most of us probably are more familiar with, begins at 4 a.m. on June 25th, 1950, as the Korean People's Army launched itself southward across the 38th parallel to the total surprise of the Republic of Korea. The unconventional one begins sometime in the night, before 4 a.m., with the Republic of Korea Army trekking across the parallel, as it had done many times before, but in more places and in a more coordinated fashion than before. That is why, in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung told his closest advisors that the South had attacked and the North needed to escalate its response. These stories are mostly the same. They don't change any of the facts of what happened after 4 a.m. What they do disagree on is what happened immediately preceding that fateful hour. The South and its supporters contend that this was a surprise attack with no warning whatsoever that completely caught the ROKA off guard. The North and its supporters contend that the South sent multiple divisions across the 38th parallel during the night of June 24th, pulling back when they realized the strength of the North. The North then had no choice but to send the might of its armed forces across the border. The invasion was just a natural reaction, a counterattack, to an initial action, an attack, by the South. Don't you see, the North Koreans had no choice but to pour almost their entire armed weight into the southern half of the peninsula? Don't mind that all of those forces were stationed close enough to the border in the first place to react so quickly and on such a large and coordinated scale to an attack. Don't you mind that at all. What I'm trying to say is that, even if the South did attack first, the North was clearly planning a large-scale military operation for sometime soon. As I said 2 weeks ago, there was nothing special about the timing of the attack. Kim was just an opportunist, and decided on the night of the 24th that now was the best opportunity. Before we move further, I just want to make a brief note. I am not a military historian, at least it is certainly not the bulk of my interest. I care more about the politics of conflict, about political violence, so that's what we're going to try to focus on. We'll discuss the movements of troops across the peninsula in broad strokes, but don't expect tactical breakdowns every single episode. We'll get into the strategy, but I'm hoping by the end of this podcast we'll all have a better understanding of what the Korean War means in political terms as much as military terms. If you're looking for a strict record of the order of battle, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We'll include some of that here, but again, that won't be what we're focused on. Books that skew more towards military history will be included in our bibliography, found in the About section of the website, if that's what you're interested in. The North Koreans had 4 main routes of attack during the first days of the invasion. Of course, there was a broad KPA advance across almost the entire peninsula, but these were the 4 main theaters of action in the first days of the war, and they're the ones I want to focus on today. The first of these was on the Ongjin Peninsula, on the western edge of the peninsula. This would probably be the easiest fighting for the Korean People's Army, as the first units to cross the border did so in the Ongjin Peninsula, securing total surprise. This was also the easiest target, I think, of the first days of the war, as it was totally cut off from the rest of South Korea. Retreat was incredibly difficult for the ROKA units on the peninsula, as all Republican troops would have to embark on sea vessels to make their escape. The day before the invasion, the commander of the defending 17th Regiment, Colonel Pak In-yup, ordered 3 battalions to defensive positions and to prepare for a limited attack against the peninsula. This was entirely based on his observations of KPA activities north of the parallel. Anything more than an attack restricted to Ongjin would necessitate a full withdrawal of ROKA troops from the peninsula, which is exactly what happened the morning of the 26th. The 17th Regiment could do nothing more than fight delaying actions to protect themselves during the day-long retreat. The second route was on the east coast of the peninsula, sandwiched between the mountains and the sea. This was supported by a set of amphibious landings that were ambitious and successful, mostly because they landed before sunrise and established defensive positions before the local ROKA leadership even knew they were there. After this initial shock and splintering of ROKA forces, the 8th Division was able to coordinate with local police forces on the best defensive positions given the situation. This is one of the few areas where the surviving units were able to consolidate after the initial attack and prepare for a cogent counterattack. Unfortunately for them, and through no fault of their own, a new order finally made it through via messenger from Army headquarters on the 4th day of the war. All remaining units were to retreat to Wonju in central South Korea and regroup with the surviving elements of the Republic of Korea Army to establish a new defensive line on the peninsula. The 3rd and 4th routes of attack were to take the greatest prize the Republic had to offer, Seoul. This was the main body of the attacking force, as Seoul was the main target of the initial advance across the parallel. The western edge of this attack had the 1st Corps of the KPA taking Kaesong, an ancient capital and culturally important city lying right on the southern side of the 38th parallel, and Uijeonbu, a bit north of Seoul, before driving down into the capital. The eastern edge would push a corridor towards Seoul from the northeast, with the 2nd Corps in charge of the advance in this sector. Both of these advances, like the others in the east and west, were amazingly successful. Almost as soon as the war began, Kaesong was occupied by KPA troops who traveled into the city by rail car. By the time Colonel Pak Sun-yup was woken by one of his aides, Kaesong had already fallen, and his 1st Division was crumbling against the weight of the advance. This Colonel Pak is the brother of the other Colonel Pak of the 17th Regiment. As Colonel Pak recounts in his memoir of the war, Republican forces were just totally caught off guard by the attack. Some brave units were able to maintain their positions along the front line, but by the end of the first day, they were forced to retreat as the units around them collapsed. The KPA forces were just too overwhelming for the ROKA to effectively manage a proper fighting retreat. This made interdivision coordination difficult, meaning counterattacks, when they could be cobbled together, were isolated and unsupported by flanking units. It is from Colonel Pak's memoir that I drew the opening story. That rail bridge was one of the few connections across the Imjin River, between Seoul and the 38th parallel, that was the intermediate defensive position for the 1st Division of the ROKA between the border and the capital. If the Imjin didn't hold, then Seoul would fall that much faster. The bridge was rigged with explosives, but when the time came, they did not go off. either damaged by explosives or they were just bad to begin with. The bridge still stood. The KPA brought tanks up to keep ROKA forces away from the south side of the river and made quick work of crossing the bridge on the morning of the 26th, continuing their rapid advance southward. To the east of the 1st Division, directly north of Seoul, the 7th Division faced equally dire circumstances. Within the first 6 hours, a wave of enemy tanks smashed directly into the front lines of the division, pushing through the infantry and artillery units at the front and threatening Uijeonbu, just north of the capital. On the 7th's right flank, the 6th Division was faring just as poorly. Like the 1st Division, the success of the 6th Division's defense depended on many things, but mostly on their ability to hold just one bridge, the Mojin Bridge, over the northern half of the Han River. This bridge would open up everything south of the Han, the final line of defense in northern South Korea, and provide a direct route into Seoul, as the Han River flows through Seoul. Like the 1st Division's rail bridge, the 6th Division was unable to hold this bridge for any longer than the first day. Quoting from the Korean Institute of Military History's History of the War, quote, approximately 4 meters in width, the Mojin Bridge might seem like an unimpressive little bridge, but because the 7th Regiment of the 6th Division did not blow up this bridge, the 47-kilometer wide regimental front completely collapsed in a single stroke, end quote. Really, every unit of the ROKA was in the same boat on the first 3 days, and their situation did not improve as they consolidated around Seoul. Counterattacks were organized but were unsuccessful. Retreats were continuous and exhausting. Colonel Pak Sun-yup did not sleep or eat until his forces reached the Han River that bisected Seoul on the 3rd day of the war. North Korean shelling was unrelenting and, if not right on top of a unit, always in the background. As you can probably tell by now, the story of the first 3 days of the war for the Republican forces was one of managed retreat, or at least attempts at managed retreat. That's not always a bad military strategy. It's how George Washington made his name during the American War of Independence. Here, though, it wasn't the best idea. I mean, I guess it was in the sense that it was kind of the only idea. Standing and fighting was definitely not an option, as the ROKA just did not have the anti-armor weapons needed to defeat the KPA's tanks. They also didn't have the hardened defensive positions that would have negated some of the strengths of the KPA's armor, and would have allowed them to hold the line anywhere along the 38th. Falling back a bit and then launching a large counterattack was also not possible because communications were just not the best, relying on messengers between division headquarters and general headquarters in Seoul. Even if they could coordinate a counterattack, the ROKA just did not have the reserves to back that up by the end of the first day. The reserves that were actually available, because remember, about a third of the entire army was on leave the day before, and that proportion was even higher in reserve divisions, just could not get their men back fast enough to put together a cohesive counterattack plan. Even those units that were strong enough to flip over to the counterattack could not, just because the supporting units around them, on the flanks and in reserve, simply weren't available. Organized retreat was really the only thing that anyone could do. As they did so, Republican units began to collapse in around Seoul, preparing for a defense of the capital. They were too late. Before they could really think about organizing a defense of the city, KPA units moved into the northern suburbs of Seoul. Already on the first day of the war, by 10 a.m., North Korean aircraft were flying over the capital. If they were armed, they strafed targets like the railway station, the armory, and government offices. If they were unarmed, they simply provided a droning reminder of the advancing threat. By the 3rd day of the war, the 27th, Kimpo Airfield, the main airfield to the west of the city, was facing consistent attacks, limiting the amount of flights that could safely make it out. American fighter aircraft were already protecting American aircraft leaving Kimpo, but nothing else over the city. And even though the United States would join the war as part of a quote-unquote police action on the 27th, remember that Seoul is 13 hours ahead of Washington, D.C., and New York City. Every decision made in those two cities is half a day behind in the general timeline, so I'll try to remind you when that matters in the future. So even when the United States pledged its support To the Southerners on the 27th, it was already well into the day in Seoul. At 1 a.m. on the 27th, Syngman Rhee met with his cabinet to discuss the course of the war so far. One decision came out of that meeting. The government would relocate to Suwon, south of Seoul. No decision was made yet by the ROKA to withdraw from Seoul or to destroy the bridges over the Han River. That's because ROKA Chief of Staff General Chae Byung-dak was assuring his less militarily inclined colleagues that the ROKA could maintain control of Seoul. Even in a session of the National Assembly early on the 27th, General Chae spoke a message of strength and hope. As he left the meeting, though, General Chae received reports from the front that painted a much, much, much more dire picture. This was only the beginning of the third day of the war. When the government announced its relocation at 6 a.m. that day, the gravity of the situation finally settled into the minds of Seoul's inhabitants. A stream of newly minted refugees slowly and then much more quickly stretched southward, reaching into the countryside like a vine, searching for a new place of safety. At 10 a.m., as more reports arrived of collapsing defensive positions and ill-fated counterattacks, General Chae finally made the necessary decision. The ROKA would abandon Seoul and destroy its bridges. The specific time for destroying the vital links between the two banks of the river was set for 2 hours before the final KPA advance into Seoul, placing the expected demolitions at 4 p.m. that day. At 12:30, Republican forces began their withdrawal from the city, as news arrived from the acting head of the Korean Military Advisory Group, Colonel W.H.S. Wright, that the United States would in fact assist the Republic of Korea in their fight against communist aggression. Bolstered by the Americans' support, General Chae reversed his earlier decision to leave and returned to his headquarters on the north side of the river. The Korean People's Army continued their successful charge down the Uijeonbu corridor into Seoul. This column was spearheaded by a mass of tanks and self-propelled artillery that the South Koreans just could not consistently effectively counter. There were some isolated successes against North Korean armor that required a great deal of effort by the frontline commanders, but mostly, KPA armor was too much for the ROKA. This was especially pronounced as the final lines of defense for Seoul collapsed late on the 27th and early on the 28th. The continuous hammering of artillery fire wore down what defenses were left and forced Republicans out of Kimpo Airfield on the 28th after an impressive river crossing by the KPA the day before, and out of Seoul soon thereafter. The preparations for the demolition of the Han River bridges in Seoul began on the night of the 26th. By 3:30 p.m. on the 27th, the ROKA engineers completed the preparations. Then, those preparations were reversed as General Chae moved his headquarters back into the city. Just as they finished undoing their work, at 11:30 p.m., the engineers were ordered to do it all again. It was now raining, though, making the job just that much worse. At 2 a.m. on the 28th, the order for demolition was given, and the 5 bridges over the Han went up in a burst of explosive force over the next few hours. Well, 3 of the 5 bridges over the Han went up in bursts of explosive force. 2 bridges, both railway bridges, had been rigged with bad charges and thus were not destroyed. This would allow the KPA to cross the Han much more quickly than was good for the ROKA. But it was a much better fate for those crossing those bridges than what was experienced by anyone crossing the 3 other bridges at the time of demolition. Between 500 and 800 civilians, fleeing from the approaching fighting, were still on the bridges at the time of demolition, leading to a massive non-combatant loss of life on day 4 of the war. Many more were injured by the blasts. Over 1 million people remained north of the river, unable to escape life in an occupied city. As KPA tanks and infantry moved into Seoul on the morning of the 28th, fighting became more desperate in the streets and alleys of the city. Some remaining ROKA units reorganized themselves into smaller, nimbler units capable of fighting guerrilla-style battles with KPA soldiers, but these units did little to slow the advance of the enemy and were often killed. Larger units were forced against the Han, where there was no way across the river save for those 2 undestroyed bridges. If they weren't near a bridge, though, their best choice was to attempt to swim across the river. That usually did not go well. KPA soldiers, once in the city, freed political prisoners and began killing any wounded Republican soldiers they could find. At the Seoul National University Hospital, 80 of 100 patients were killed in a last-ditch defense of the hospital. At 11:30 in the morning, North Korean soldiers were marching through the center of the southern capital. Seoul had fallen. Later in the day, Kim Il-sung's voice rang through the streets of Seoul, welcoming his new comrades into his shining Democratic People's Republic. The First Corps of the KPA took over administration of the city alongside a new People's Committee. The property of elites, most of whom had fled anyway, was quickly seized, as were government buildings, military facilities, etc. After the mint was seized, the occupiers began printing large amounts of South Korean won, devaluing the currency rapidly to justify the official exchange rate of 8 Southern Korean won for 1 North Korean won. The South Korean economy began to spiral as the newly printed worthless currency flowed into the areas where it could be used, as it was no longer accepted in occupied zones. Surprisingly to the communists, while the civilians left behind in Seoul may have accepted the occupation, they did so begrudgingly. There was no mass uprising in support of the KPA as was expected. Any enthusiasm the occupiers felt from the occupied was often forced and insincere. I don't know exactly why there wasn't an uprising either against or in favor of the occupation. Personally, though, I think it's a mixture of resignation and apathy, as Koreans had already spent much of their lives in an occupied land and just wanted to go on with their lives. I don't think we'll ever really know who was at fault for the beginning of the Korean War. There is decent evidence to support each story, mostly reports by high-ranking military and civilian officials in the U.S. military and diplomatic apparatus, and some official documents that show prior American planning for war on the peninsula. Situation planning like that is pretty par for the course though, so I don't think it reveals a plot by the Americans to instigate a war in Korea. The South Koreans certainly had good reasons to nudge North Korea to war, but we can only verify one of the two stories of the beginning of the war. Thus is just the nature of a highly secretive state in the DPRK, a state with a vested interest in never entertaining the possibility of an initial provocation in the ROK, and a never-ending war. There are genuine arguments to be made that both sides are at fault. They had both crossed the border many times before, and both sides wanted to take the other side to war, so it was inevitable that war would come to Korea at some point. That's why I don't think it matters who started the war, though. It's an important question to discuss, but its importance comes from the discussion, and not from a definitive answer. What comes after is far more important. And that's what we'll spend the next, maybe 6 months on. If you want to discuss this with me, though, please find me on social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or even Instagram. You could also send an email, which can be found on our website. But that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the front line stretching from Gimpo in the west through Seoul to Gangneung in the east. Next week, we will continue to discuss the first weeks of the war, including the entrance of the United States and the United Nations into the conflict. If you are on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.